Imagine plummeting 2 miles from the sky, strapped to an airline seat.
Right. Plunging directly into the heart of the Amazon rainforest.
Exactly. You are a 17-year-old girl caught in a severe thunderstorm, and, well, the laws of physics dictate that you should not survive this descent.
But you do.
You do. And what saves you and continues to save you for the next 11 days in one of the world's most extreme environments is not a miracle.
No, it is your childhood education.
Today, we are speaking directly to you, the listener, as we embark on a meticulous exploration of a life defined by biology, human endurance, and the rigorous application of scientific knowledge.
We are tracing the biography of Juliane Koepcke,
A German-Peruvian mammologist.
Yes. This journey will examine the exact mechanics of her survival and follow the trajectory of her life, her work, and her lasting scientific legacy.
Right, up to the date of our historical documents.
That is the precise objective of our analysis today.
We are examining an event that demonstrates how extreme, chaotic circumstances can be navigated.
Navigated through systematic scientific training, yes, and an intimate understanding of environmental variables.
By strictly analyzing the factual record, the physics of aerodynamics, the biology of the Amazonian ecosystem, and the physiology of human trauma, we can observe this.
We observe how theoretical and practical knowledge translates into survival during moments of severe physical stress.
It is a study of cause and effect at the extreme limits of human capability.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting at the very beginning of her documented life.
Establishing the foundation that would later prove absolutely critical.
Yes. Juliane Koepcke was born on October 10th, 1954.
In Lima, Peru.
She was the only child of two German zoologists.
Her mother was Maria, whose maiden name was von Michelitz-Radecki.
And her father was Hans Wilhelm Koepcke.
Right. At the time of Juliane's birth, both of her parents were working at Lima's Museum of Natural History.
Which is an important detail. This immediate environment, being raised by two professional zoologists working within a national museum, establishes a very specific educational baseline.
From day one.
From day one, yes. To understand the mechanics of her later survival, we must first analyze the precise nature of that upbringing.
Being the only child of two working zoologists.
Exactly. It means her primary exposure to the world was framed entirely through the lens of biological science.
Her parents were dedicated scientists, classifying and studying complex ecosystems.
Consequently, her early cognitive development was steeped in the methodologies of environmental observation.
Species categorization, right.
And the scientific method itself. She was absorbing the vocabulary of zoology.
Learning to look at an environment not just as scenery, but as an interconnected system of flora, fauna, and geological features.
That foundation takes a dramatic physical shift when she reaches the age of 14.
At this point, Juliane left the urban environment of Lima with her parents.
Their objective was to establish the Penguana Research Station.
Located directly in the dense Amazon rainforest.
Yes. This is where she acquired highly specific, critical survival skills.
However, this relocation initiated a significant conflict, didn't it?
It did. The educational authorities in Peru strongly disapproved of this arrangement.
They eventually intervened.
They forced her to leave the rainforest and return to Lima.
Specifically to the Deutsche Schule Lima Alexander von Humboldt.
Right, so that she could formally prepare for and take her standardized exams.
She complied with this requirement, passed her exams, and officially graduated.
On December 23, 1971.
The transition you just outlined requires careful analysis.
It represents a profound duality in her education.
At the Penguana Research Station, she was receiving a hands-on, immersive environmental education.
Her parents were teaching her how to read the complex, often unforgiving ecosystem of the Amazon.
She was learning to identify indigenous plant species,
Track moving water,
understand the behavioral patterns of local insects and predators,
and navigate dense topography.
Then, the educational authorities mandated her return to a structured classroom setting in Lima.
It forces us to examine the friction between those two worlds.
It is a fascinating reversal of a traditional zoological study. For years, she was observing and learning within a wild, deeply complex, and untamed habitat.
Then suddenly, she's the one being pulled from that environment.
And placed into a rigid, highly controlled enclosure.
The formal education system, yes.
It is like stepping out of a vast, limitless ocean directly into a small, rigid container.
The authorities pulled a student away from an immersive, highly practical scientific education simply to fulfill a standardized testing metric.
Which raises questions about their framework. The authorities were operating under a formalized framework that equates educational completion strictly with passing exams.
Exams at an institution like the Deutsche Schule Lena Alexander von Humboldt.
They view the acquisition of knowledge through the metric of formal written testing.
Conversely, her parents were providing an education grounded in experiential survival.
And advanced biological observation.
Ultimately, Juliane navigated both systems successfully, achieving her graduation on December 23, 1971.
Yet, as the chronology advances, it becomes evident that the practical knowledge acquired at the Panguana Research Station would dictate her survival.
Not the formal schooling in Lima.
Right. That brings us exactly to the timeline of December 1971.
The date of her graduation, December 23, acts as the central pivot point for everything that follows.
We see a very specific sequence of logistical decisions occurring here.
Her mother, Maria, originally wanted Juliane to return to the Panguana Research Station much earlier in the month.
Specifically on December 19 or 20.
However, Juliane insisted on remaining in Lima to attend her formal graduation ceremony on the 23rd.
Maria conceded to this request.
And because of this change in schedule, they had to book a flight for the following day.
Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1971.
This raises an important question regarding the cascading effect of seemingly ordinary logistical decisions.
We are observing how the desire to participate in a standard societal rite of passage, the high school graduation ceremony, fundamentally altered their spatial and temporal trajectory.
Exactly. Had they adhered to Maria's original schedule and departed on December 19 or 20, the entire event would have been circumvented.
Instead, the commitment to the formal ceremony on the 23rd compressed their travel window.
Into one of the most heavily congested travel days of the calendar year.
And the congestion of Christmas Eve severely limited their options.
Every single flight out of Lima was completely fully booked.
With one single exception.
There were seats available on a flight operated by the airline LANSA.
This was LANSA Flight 508.
The historical record reveals a crucial point of tension prior to booking.
Juliane's father, Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, explicitly urged his wife to avoid flying with this specific airline.
He cited LANSA's decidedly poor reputation as the reason for his warning.
Despite his explicit instructions, the decision was made and the flight was booked.
We must objectively analyze the weight of that unheeded warning.
Hans Wilhelm's assessment of LANSA's poor reputation was actionable intelligence regarding operational risk.
However, that intelligence was ultimately overridden by the logistical pressure of the schedule.
The desire to return to Panguana immediately following the graduation.
Combined with the absolute lack of available alternatives on Christmas Eve.
It created a scenario where convenience and immediate urgency superseded recognized risk.
It was a fatalistic compromise dictated purely by scheduling constraints.
Here's where it gets really interesting as we move into the physical events of December 24th, 1971.
Mid-flight, LANSA Flight 508 encounters extreme atmospheric chaos.
The aircraft is struck by lightning.
Following this strike, the plane begins to structurally disintegrate while still in the air.
Thousands of feet above the ground.
Juliane Koepcke is suddenly subjected to a free fall of 3,000 meters.
Which is approximately 10,000 feet.
Directly into the Amazon rainforest.
During this descent, she remains strapped into her window seat.
The specific seat is attached to the two other seats to her left,
forming an intact row of three.
The mechanics of this fall require highly detailed scientific analysis, as they represent an extraordinary anomaly in physics and aerodynamics.
To fall 3,000 meters from a disintegrating aircraft and survive is an outcome that defies standard probabilities.
Experts who have studied this event determine that her survival was the result of a simultaneous, highly improbable alignment of several specific physical and environmental factors.
We must look at the structural configuration first.
She was harnessed into a window seat permanently attached to two empty seats.
This three-seat row configuration fundamentally altered her aerodynamic profile during the descent.
Wait, let me stop you there. A three-seat row altering an aerodynamic profile.
I am trying to visualize this.
Common sense suggests that three heavy commercial airline seats would just act like a massive anvil, dragging her down faster and harder.
Can you break down the actual aerodynamics of how a structure like that could function like a parachute or a helicopter, as the experts suggest?
It comes down to the principles of aerodynamic drag and surface area to mass ratio.
Okay.
A single human body falling through the atmosphere reaches a relatively high terminal velocity because it is dense and relatively streamlined. However, a rigid structure composed of three joined airline seats creates a much larger asymmetrical surface area.
As this wide, uneven object falls through the air, it does not fall straight down like a dart.
The asymmetrical air resistance induces a tumbling or spiraling motion.
If this three-seat structure begins to auto-rotate, much like the wing seat of a maple tree spinning to the ground or a helicopter rotor spinning without engine power, it generates substantial drag.
This drag serves as an upward force that directly counteracts the downward acceleration of gravity.
Effectively reducing her terminal velocity.
So the seats themselves are acting as a mechanical brake against the air.
But the seat configuration alone does not fully account for her survival.
We also have to look at the severe thunderstorm itself.
The very atmospheric conditions that caused the destruction of the aircraft actually provided a crucial counterforce.
During her fall, she passed precisely through an updraft.
That is the leading scientific consensus.
An updraft is a localized vertical column of upward moving air.
Within severe thunderstorms, the thermal dynamics create updrafts that can reach extreme vertical velocities.
As Juliane was falling downward, the auto-rotating three-seat row was already maximizing aerodynamic drag.
Simultaneously, her trajectory intersected one of these powerful thunderstorm updrafts,
The upward velocity of the air column provided a massive opposing force.
further decelerating her rate of descent long before she reached the surface.
The storm that destroyed the aircraft actively slowed her fall.
And then there's the third factor, the surface impact.
She did not strike bare earth, solid rock, or open water.
She struck the dense foliage of the Amazon rainforest canopy.
The structure of a jungle canopy is incredibly complex.
It is multi-layered, comprising thick branches, dense vines, and broad leaves.
This canopy acted as a final sequential braking mechanism.
It cushioned the impact, absorbing and dissipating the remaining kinetic energy of her fall.
Over a vertical distance of several dozen feet through the trees.
It prevented that kinetic energy from being transferred entirely in a single, instantaneous, and fatal impact with the solid ground.
Synthesizing these variables reveals an infinitely small window for human survival.
If any single one of these variables had been absent or slightly altered, the outcome would have been universally fatal.
If she had been separated from the three-seat harness, her terminal velocity would have been too high.
If she had fallen through a downdraft instead of an updraft, she would have been accelerated toward the earth.
If she had landed in a cleared section of the jungle rather than the densest foliage, the kinetic energy upon impact would have destroyed her physical structure.
The convergence of these specific physics and environmental anomalies allowed her to survive the 3,000-meter descent.
But surviving the fall was merely the initiation of her ordeal.
This brings us directly to the 11-day crucible in the Amazon rainforest.
Let us meticulously detail her physical condition upon regaining consciousness on the jungle floor.
The physical trauma was severe. She sustained a broken collarbone.
She had a deep, open cut on her right arm.
She suffered a significant eye injury.
She had a ruptured ligament in her knee.
And she was suffering from a concussion.
Despite this compounding trauma, she survived completely alone in the rainforest for 11 days.
And our primary strategy during this time was singular and methodical.
She located a small creek, and she followed it to a river.
We must analyze the interception of her severe physiological state and her psychological resolve here.
A concussion fundamentally impairs cognitive function, spatial orientation, and decision-making,
A ruptured knee ligament severely destabilizes the mechanics of the joint,
making weight-bearing incredibly difficult and causing immense pain.
particularly on the uneven, root-choked terrain of a rainforest floor.
A broken collarbone restricts upper body mobility and balance.
Yet, despite these traumas, her cognitive processing remained rigidly oriented toward a specific survival strategy.
This is where the direct application of her parents' zoological education manifests.
I want you to really consider the sheer physical toll of this strategy.
Imagine attempting a grueling, multi-day trek through dense, trackless jungle terrain.
Now imagine executing that trek while a ruptured knee ligament gives way with every step.
And a concussion clouds your vision and distorts your balance.
The disorientation would be overwhelming.
I want to ask you to clarify the environmental logic here. Why was following moving water the definitively correct decision in this specific ecosystem?
The strategy of following moving water is a fundamental geographical and biological principle of the Amazon basin.
One her zoologist parents would have ingrained in her.
In a dense rainforest environment, a small creek will invariably flow into a larger stream.
And that stream will eventually feed into a major river system.
Human settlements, lumber encampments, and transit routes in the Amazon are almost exclusively located along these major waterways.
As the rivers serve as the primary infrastructure of the region.
By committing to following the creek, she was utilizing undeniable environmental logic to guarantee that her path would eventually intersect with human activity,
Furthermore, moving water provides a continuous, relatively safe source of hydration.
which is biologically critical to sustaining cellular function and physical exertion over an 11-day period while traumatized.
Her endurance was tested by more than just her physical injuries and the treacherous terrain.
She faced severe biological adversities during those 11 days.
She endured relentless insect bites, which is an expected hazard.
But far more distressingly, she suffered an infestation of botfly larvae deep inside the open cut on her right arm.
The infestation of botfly larvae introduces a secondary level of extreme physiological stress.
And a severe biological threat.
Botflies are indigenous to the neotropical region.
The adult female fly captures a mosquito or a tick, lays her eggs on it, and releases it.
When that victor insect lands on a mammalian host, in this case, Juliane, the body heat of the host triggers the botfly eggs to hatch.
The microscopic larvae then drop onto the skin and actively burrow into the subcutaneous tissue.
Often utilizing an existing open wound like the deep cut on her arm.
Once inside the tissue, they anchor themselves with backward-facing spines and begin to feed and mature.
And because of her education, she knew exactly what was happening to her body.
She was fully aware of the biological mechanism of the parasite.
She knew that these larvae cause localized tissue damage, intense pain, and carry a massive risk of systemic infection.
Which could easily turn fatal in a jungle environment without antibiotics.
Exactly. The psychological burden of understanding the precise life cycle of the parasite consuming your tissue is immense.
On day 9 of her trek, however, her strategy of following the water finally yielded a tangible result.
She discovered an encampment that had been established by local lumberjacks.
She remained at the encampment, and several hours later, the lumberjacks returned and found her.
Their immediate medical intervention for the botfly infestation in her arm was brutal.
But highly effective.
They poured gasoline directly into the open wound to treat the larvae.
Following this treatment, they placed her in a canoe and transported her for 11 straight hours down the river to a more inhabited area,
where she was finally airlifted to a medical hospital.
The lumberjacks' use of gasoline is a stark example of localized medical ingenuity in the absence of clinical supplies.
Gasoline is highly toxic and acts as a potent chemical irritant.
But we have to understand the biology of the botfly to understand why this works.
Even though the larvae are buried deep in the tissue, they must maintain a breathing tube,
known as a spiracle,
at the surface of the skin to access oxygen.
When the lumberjacks poured gasoline over the wound, the thick chemical composition cut off the oxygen supply
and created a suffocating, toxic environment.
This forced the larvae to back out of the deep tissue and move toward the surface to breathe,
allowing them to be manually extracted or killed.
It is an excruciating procedure, but it effectively neutralizes the immediate biological threat.
The execution of that procedure, followed immediately by an 11-hour canoe journey, highlights the extreme remoteness of her location.
The logistics of extracting a critically injured survivor from the deep Amazon are incredibly complex.
Relying entirely on the river networks she had successfully navigated to.
As Juliane was recovering in the hospital, the full scope of the disaster became clear.
The search operations yielded a tragic parallel.
Juliane Koepcke was not the only person to survive the initial impact of LANSA Flight 508.
The documentation indicates that up to 14 other passengers survived the initial crash and the fall to the jungle floor.
However, all 14 of these individuals died while waiting to be rescued.
Once Juliane had recovered sufficiently, she actually assisted the search parties in navigating the terrain,
locating the crash site and recovering the bodies of the victims.
During this grim process, her own mother's body was discovered on January 12, 1972.
We must approach this section with objective gravity, analyzing the variables that dictate survival.
The revelation that up to 14 other passengers survived the initial descent, only to perish in the subsequent days, fundamentally alters the analysis of the event.
It shifts the focus from the aerodynamic anomaly of surviving the fall to the specific behavioral and physical variables required to survive the aftermath in the jungle.
We must analyze precisely what separated Juliane's outcome from the outcomes of the other 14 survivors.
Based strictly on the facts, the differentiation relies on two primary factors:
her physical mobility and her specialized knowledge.
While she was severely injured with a ruptured knee ligament and a broken collarbone, she retained just enough physical mobility to continuously move.
Others may have sustained pelvic, spinal, or severe compound fractures that entirely immobilized them.
But crucially, she possessed the specific geographical and biological knowledge to follow the moving water.
The other survivors remained stationary near the wreckage, waiting for an aerial rescue that simply could not see them.
That is an accurate assessment of the survival variables.
In a dense Amazonian environment, remaining stationary after a crash significantly decreases the probability of discovery.
The dense canopy completely obscures visual lines of sight from aerial search teams.
Aircrafts can fly directly over a crash site without spotting the wreckage or survivors beneath the leaves.
Juliane's zoological training provided her with the imperative to self-rescue by navigating the topography.
The discovery of her mother's body on January 12, 1972, concludes the immediate timeline of the disaster.
It confirms the total loss of all other passengers and establishes the profound baseline of her subsequent life.
So what does this all mean for her trajectory after the event?
How does a person process that kind of dual trauma, surviving the impossible while losing a parent?
The psychological toll was profound. She suffered from intense nightmares for years.
She experienced deep, pervasive survivor's guilt, constantly haunted by the specific question,
Why was I the only survivor?
to fully recover from her physical injuries and begin to process the trauma, she relocated from Peru to West Germany.
The native country of both her parents.
But the path she chose next is truly remarkable.
Following directly in her parents' legacy, she enrolled at the University of Kiel to formally study biology.
She successfully graduated in 1980.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, her academic choices reveal a profound psychological and intellectual resilience.
After experiencing catastrophic physical trauma and the devastating loss of her mother within the Amazon rainforest, the standard human psychological inclination might be to avoid that specific environment.
Or the study of it entirely.
Instead, she methodically pursued the exact scientific discipline her parents practiced.
By studying biology at the University of Kiel, she was equipping herself with the formal, rigorous academic framework necessary to systematically understand and categorize the very forces of nature she had endured.
And she did not stop at her initial degree.
She continued her rigorous academic trajectory, going on to earn her doctorate from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich.
Her focus remained incredibly specific and heavily tied to her past.
In 1987, she officially published her thesis.
The title of this thesis was Ecological Study of a Bat Colony in the Tropical Rainforest of Peru.
She had become a mammologist, and her specific area of expertise was bats.
She deliberately returned to the precise environment, the tropical rainforest of Peru, to conduct complex, on-the-ground ecological research.
The significance of her thesis title and her chosen specialization cannot be overstated in an objective analysis of her life.
Ecological Study of a Bat Colony in the Tropical Rainforest of Peru represents a complete, systematic reclamation of her narrative.
She transitioned from being a vulnerable survivor, subjected to the chaotic, uncontrolled variables of the jungle, to becoming a master of that environment,
analyzing its complex ecological networks as a fully credentialed expert.
Furthermore, specializing in mammalogy, and specifically bats, is highly relevant.
Bats are a critical indicator species for the overall health of rainforest ecosystems.
This demonstrates a lifelong commitment to deep, methodical observation of the exact biome that claimed her mother's life.
It is a testament to utilizing scientific inquiry as a mechanism to process and transcend profound trauma.
This dedication to biological science extends deeply into her leadership roles and her lasting legacy.
The timeline shows a continuous integration of her family's work with her own distinct scientific achievements.
In 1989, she married Eric Diller.
Interestingly, he is also a highly specialized scientist, a German entomologist whose specific area of research is parasitic wasps.
This creates a fascinating alignment in her personal life,
directly echoing the dedicated zoological partnership that her own parents shared.
They are both committed to the meticulous study of complex biological systems.
That alignment is notable from an analytical perspective.
Entomologists who specialize in parasitic wasps study complex, often brutal biological life cycles.
Mechanisms very similar to the botfly larvae she encountered and understood during her survival trek.
Her partnership with Eric Diller reinforces a shared worldview grounded in objective scientific observation, data collection, and environmental research.
This shared dedication ensures that her life trajectory remains deeply rooted in the analytical traditions she was raised in at the museum in Lima and the station at Panguana.
Furthermore, in the year 2000, following the death of her father, Hans Wilhelm, she officially took over as the director of the Panguana Research Station.
This is the very same remote station her parents established when she was 14 years old.
Alongside this vital leadership role managing research in Peru, she also served as a librarian at the Bavarian State Collection of Zoology in Munich,
Her career demonstrates a continuous dual commitment.
actively managing field research in the Amazon, while simultaneously maintaining formal archiving and scientific study in Germany.
Taking over the directorship of the Panguana Research Station in 2000 represents the ultimate synthesis of her life's work and her family's historical legacy.
It ensures the operational continuity of the ecological observation her parents initiated decades prior.
Concurrently serving as a librarian at a major zoological collection in Munich demonstrates her ongoing commitment to the preservation, categorization, and dissemination of scientific knowledge.
She operates efficiently and authoritatively in both the primary field environment of the rainforest and the secondary institutional environment of the European Museum.
Her unique life and scientific achievements have also been formally recognized on a major international scale.
In 2011, she released her autobiography.
The original German title translates exactly to When I Fell from the Sky, How the Jungle Gave Me My Life Back,
The book was published by Piper Verlag, and it achieved significant acclaim.
winning the prestigious Korean Literature Prize that same year.
Later, in 2019, the Peruvian government formally acknowledged her immense, lifelong contributions to the country's scientific record.
By making her a Grand Officer of the Order of Merit for Distinguished Services.
The specific phrasing of her autobiography's title, How the Jungle Gave Me My Life Back, requires careful, objective analysis.
It directly contradicts the common, sensationalized public perception of the jungle as purely a hostile adversary.
Instead, she explicitly frames a complex rainforest ecosystem as a restorative force.
The very mechanism of her salvation in 1971, and the ongoing focus of her entire life's work.
The international recognition she received, both the literary prize in Germany and the high governmental honor in Peru, validates her unique dual position.
As both a historical figure of extraordinary survival and a leading, objective scientific authority on the Amazonian biome.
This naturally transitions us to analyzing how her story has been presented to the public, focusing on media portrayals and how she actively controlled her own narrative.
The historical record shows that initial, early attempts to tell her story were highly inaccurate.
In 1974, a low-budget, heavily fictionalized Italian film directed by Giuseppe Maria Scotes was released.
The film was titled I Miracoli Accadono Ancora, which translates to Miracles Still Happen.
Though it is sometimes known as the story of Juliane Koepcke.
In this dramatization, she was portrayed by the English actress Susan Penhaligon.
What's fascinating here is the intersection of factual historical events and early media representation.
The 1974 film represents a common media phenomenon.
A complex, deeply traumatic, and scientifically nuanced event is rapidly commodified and fictionalized for mass entertainment purposes.
Heavily fictionalized accounts inherently strip away the methodical, objective reality of survival.
The aerodynamics, the biology, these specific ecological knowledge.
And replace them with dramatized tropes and emotional spectacle.
It is completely logical why a serious, credentialed scientist would deliberately distance herself from such a scientifically inaccurate portrayal.
She maintained that distance for decades.
It wasn't until 1998 that a rigorously faithful retelling occurred.
And this was executed through a documentary titled Wings of Hope, directed by the renowned German filmmaker Werner Herzog.
The historical documents reveal an incredible, almost statistical impossibility connecting Herzog to the events of December 24th, 1971.
Werner Herzog was actually scheduled to be a passenger on that exact same LANSA Flight 508.
He was actively scouting locations in the Amazon for his film Aguirre, The Wrath of God, which was released in 1972.
However, he was spared from the disintegration of the aircraft because of a last-minute itinerary change.
The direct involvement of Werner Herzog introduces a profound layer of historical coincidence to the documentation of the event.
Herzog's near-miss inherently intertwined his own timeline with Juliane's.
For Herzog, document of her survival was not merely an objective journalistic exercise.
It was an exploration of this specific physical disaster he narrowly avoided by sheer logistical chance.
This shared proximity to the event, one surviving the fall, The other, avoiding the flight, entirely likely fostered a level of mutual understanding and respect that a standard, unconnected journalist could not provide.
Because Juliane actively avoided the media for so long, Herzog had to go to extreme lengths to locate her.
He eventually found her through the priest who had performed her mother's funeral years prior.
When she finally agreed to participate in the documentary, she took a monumental step.
She actually accompanied Herzog back to the exact site of the crash deep in the Amazon.
She later described this return to the physical wreckage as a kind of therapy.
Furthermore, when the journalist Franz Lids eventually interviewed her, an interview where he noted she was one of his most interesting subjects, he was only successful in convincing her to participate by agreeing to her very strict terms.
He had to agree to focus entirely on the science of her survival, rather than focusing on the childhood trauma.
Her establishment of that boundary with the journalist Franz Lids is highly instructive regarding her self-identification.
By demanding that the interview focus strictly on the physical and biological mechanisms of her survival, rather than the emotional trauma, she asserted her primary identity as a scientist.
She utilized the media interest in her historical survival to disseminate accurate biological and ecological facts.
Returning to the crash site with Herzog as a form of therapy further demonstrates her methodical approach to processing the event.
By confronting the physical location of the disaster, she categorized it, studied it, and integrated it into her understanding of the world.
Much exactly like she would study a complex ecological system in her research.
We have traced an extraordinary trajectory today.
We started with a childhood foundation steeped in zoology,
Analyzed an impossible descent governed by atmospheric physics,
examined an 11-day survival predicated entirely on environmental logic,
and followed a lifelong career dedicated to the rigorous study of the very ecosystem that shaped her existence.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building purely on the facts we have discussed.
Consider the profound paradox of the Amazon rainforest in Juliane Koepcke's life.
It is an environment often perceived by outsiders as a hostile, uninhabitable wilderness.
And indeed, it was the site of profound, catastrophic loss for her.
Yet, because of her scientific understanding and her deep practical education, that exact same hostile wilderness was simultaneously her sanctuary.
Her savior, and eventually the definitive work of her entire life.
It challenges you to consider how a deep, rigorous knowledge of an environment completely alters one's relationship to adversity within it. Thanks for listening.